Peace and love, y'all. My name's Naeem. I got another video here for you guys about remote viewing, ESP, clairvoyance, the fuller extent of human consciousness, basically. So I want to focus this video on the idea of AOL, analytical overlay. Why does it happen? How does it happen? A lot of people ask questions about is it possible to get rid of AOL, or how can I reduce AOL? Well, this is a video you're going to want to pay attention to then. I'm going to talk about AOL probing. I'm going to point out the differences in the idea of intelligence. So different intelligences in our consciousness, and then the whole idea of impulses that you get from the target, the way the target signal interacts with the threshold of awareness and our awareness, what we perceive and what we interpret, our impressions from the signal. So I'm also going to show some interesting videos on agnosia, visual agnosia, which is a certain condition that people who suffered from different types of brain damage, usually strokes, who have certain damage in different areas of the brain, which gives them this kind of like perceptual deficiency. So we're going to look at that and kind of show the similarities in remote viewing, and kind of point out how this can be helped to highlight AOL and maybe overcoming it or seeing the AOL in a way that's more helpful. Alright, so probing. So probing is one of the first things that you're going to become familiar with when you start practicing remote viewing, or you start actually doing the experiential part of this, because there's a lot of people who watch videos about remote viewing, read about remote viewing, are well aware of the phenomenon, but maybe have never actually experienced it, or never really had the experience for themselves. But once you start having these experiences a lot, you do a couple hundred sessions, couple thousand sessions, probing is one of the main tools that you use to gain data in remote viewing. So what is a probe? That's when you take the pencil or the pen, your writing utensil, and you're touching it to the paper or the ideogram or the drawing, and you're basically requesting information. And so probe, we're going to look at this definition of probe. Okay, so probe, to search into and explore very thoroughly. Okay, subject to a penetrating investigation. So that would be like a probe. They say like the FBI probed drug ring or whatever. You know what I mean? Probe implies penetration to investigate or explore something hidden from sight or knowledge. So like they probe the depths of the sea. So that's an interesting definition in terms to remote viewing, or ESP, anomalous cognition. Penetration to investigate or explore something hidden from sight or knowledge. That's exactly what we're doing, right? You got this hidden target, and so we're probing to penetrate, to investigate. So what is penetrate then? Penetrate has a bunch of different definitions, so we're going to look at the ones that are interesting to the topic here. So penetrate, to pass into or through, to gain entrance to see into or through, to discover the inner contents or meaning of, to affect profoundly with feeling, to pierce something with the eye or mind. Okay, so those are a couple definitions of probe. So when you probe, you're gaining entrance to the target. You're seeing through or into things and concepts. You're discovering the inner contents or meanings of something. So this is going to be important when you're doing remote viewing. There's a lot of times where something is manifest, a piece of data is collected, and you don't know what the inner contents or the meaning of that is. So this is why probing becomes important. You need to penetrate the outer, pass into or through the outer appearances of these things to find out their inner meanings, the contents. So like probing, you're applying like pressure with the pencil or the pen on the paper. So you're making like an impression onto the target, like you're pushing the pen down on the target. Well, I like to think of it as like you're putting an impression on the target, while at the same time the target's going to put an impression on you. So every time you probe, you're you're putting this impression physically on the target, and the target is kind of like putting this mental impression on you, and it can manifest in different ways, as we're gonna go into here. That's what probing is. So probing is when you're piercing something with the eye or the mind. Okay, you're affecting profoundly with feeling. You're gaining entrance or seeing through or into something. That's probing. AOL, this whole idea of AOL is more associated with thinking and judgment, things like that, more analytical functions. AOL stands for analytical overlay, right? So thinking is the process of forming an opinion or evaluation by discerning and comparing. Alright, so you can see that probing, a probe, to probe something and to think about something, these are two different, these aren't the same things, right? When you're thinking, you're forming opinions, you're evaluating and discerning, you're comparing. Probing, you're piercing something, you're gaining entrance into it, you're discovering the inner contents and meanings of things. Judgment is an opinion or estimate so formed, or a formal utterance of an authoritative opinion. So judgments aren't really a probe. Judgment is not what you want to be doing in remote viewing, especially not in when you don't have enough information to make an estimate or an authoritative opinion. You don't want to be making judgments. You don't want to be thinking when you don't have enough pieces of information to compare or make any discernments from. The problem with AOL is the conscious mind, the awareness, conscious self knows that there is a target. So you may not know what the target is, but you know there's this game that you're about to play. You know that there's something that you're supposed to perceive, and you're supposed to give a description of it in some way, shape, or form. So it's like doing a puzzle. So like traditional puzzles, the box has the picture, the end result of what the puzzle is supposed to look like, and you get all these pieces, and you can look at the box, find the little pieces, see how they fit together, and logically kind of put it together. The remote viewing puzzle that you're doing in a remote viewing session isn't as straightforward. The end result isn't shown to you for you to just copy and follow suit, and the pieces don't fit together so physically evident. You know what I mean? I would say the remote viewing puzzle is more like a tangram. If you don't know what a tangram is, that's like those puzzles that the puzzle pieces don't fit together in the traditional way. They can go together in multiple configurations, and you can make multiple figures out of these tangrams, right? So the remote viewing puzzle is kind of more like a tangram. The conscious mind can only play so much of a role in this kind of puzzle. So there's two different types of like AOLs. There's two main different types of like AOL phenomenon that happen. In CRV, the one is called AOL, and then they have another column called AOL/S, AOL of the signal. So one of those AOLs is pretty easy to reduce, and with practice you can pretty much you'll eliminate it to a certain degree. You can greatly reduce that first kind of AOL. The AOL of the signal kind, those types of phenomenon will probably always be occurring to some degree or another within remote viewing, but with better understanding of the mechanisms behind it, you can learn to use it to your advantage. It doesn't have to be this kind of like thing that you avoid and kind of dance around, because that can like ruin the flow of information. this here is the threshold of awareness. Okay, we got conscious things that you're aware of and things that are below your threshold of awareness here. Okay, so we can imagine the remote viewing signal comes up, touches the threshold of awareness like this, something like this. Okay, this is a very simplex representation here. Okay, these are simplex visualizations to help gain a better understanding of how these things might work. Okay, so we got the remote viewing signal. If you didn't see my last video on brainwaves, you can check that out. I'll put a link here for that. But the idea here is that whenever you're remote viewing, whenever you probe, you're penetrating the deeper meaning of things, you're gaining the insight, you're entering into. Okay, so you can imagine it looking something like this. Okay, you can imagine this line as the brainwaves. Okay, so as you get more focused, you drop down closer to the threshold of awareness. Alright, this is what happens. You get in focus, you're probing. Something happens here. These two signals have an interference with each other. Okay, so where these signals interfere, that's where you're having a perception of something. Alright, but it's not as straightforward as you just directly perceive the signal like that. Okay, so there's a bunch of processes that happen in the time between where the signal actually enters your information system and that it gets into your conscious awareness for you to actually give your response. Okay, so AOL has to do with the stuff that happens right here in your internal processing. Okay, so AOL has to do with this. So this has to do with the difference between impulses and responses. Okay, so AOL happens usually happens in this area right here. Okay, I've talked about this in an earlier video, but basically these are like what we call like real impressions. Okay, so like real data signal. Everything else would be considered like noise. So things that aren't the signal. So this is usually where AOL happens, in these areas in between actual target contact. So this is where you usually be guessing, trying to formulate a story about the data that you collected here and here. So let's say you collected information here and here. Now that you probed, you listed listed the data. Now you got this time here in between. Your conscious mind has a function where it wants to like come to a conclusion. So that's its job. One of the intelligences in the conscious mind is to come to this conclusion. Something happened here and something happened there. So it's trying to like formulate a story. What happened first? Why did this happen? Cause and effect. It's trying to figure that out. And then it's going to make up a story. It's going to bring these things together, which is like what we were talking about with thinking, right? Comparing and discerning and trying to come to a conclusion. So that's the most common type of AOL, right? Conscious thinking of data that you already produced. Like you listed something and then now you're kind of like thinking about the stuff you already listed. Okay, and you're coming up with ideas. That's like the most common type of AOL. That type of AOL, with time, you'll just get better with training by using the AOL column, writing it in the AOL column. You'll start to recognize, that behavior. You'll be like, okay, I always jump to conclusions, and you'll eventually correct yourself. But the type of AOLs, these are the type of AOLs that can be reduced pretty easily with practice. The other type of AOL, which in CRV is usually called like AOL over the signal. There's like two AOL columns. So like AOL/S, AOL over the signal. that's something else. This is something that's more. This is more of like the kind of idea that this might be like unavoidable. Like stuff like this might always happen. The main difference why these AOL over the signal types may always happen has to do with the difference between like impulses and responses. Okay, so a response is a reaction to like a stimulus. So whenever the remote viewing signal, we got the threshold of awareness, awareness and non-aware. Whenever the signal, so let's say this is a remote viewing signal. Whenever you have a perception, so let's say right here, you have a perception. The remote viewing signal meets your brainwave signal or crosses the threshold of awareness. Okay. This causes an influence of some sort. So our traditional idea of cause and effect is a little flawed. So we like to think of things as cause and then the effect, right? We like to think in terms of cause and effect, like a two-step process. One causes the other. But in reality, it's more something like cause, and then there's some kind of influence, and then we see the effects. This is more of it's more of like a three-step process, and that's where this AOL stuff comes in. So the target signal and the brainwave sync up. You have a perception here where the signals interfere. This causes an influence. They're influencing each other. So your brainwaves, or your awareness is coming in contact with this target signal. So you're kind of like bringing some of your awareness into this, right? Like probe, like we were saying. Probe is to like enter into. So you're like entering into this information field. All right. So it's having an influence on you. You're having an influence on it. And then that's going to cause some kind of effect. Okay? So it's not as straightforward as that the signal just comes into your consciousness and then you just perceive it. The signal has some kind of influence, and then the influence causes some kind of effect. Whenever you probing the signal gives you an impulse. Now this is something that you're going to have to observe through practice and doing this over and over again. When you probe, you're going to get an impulse. So this is the result of this influence of the target signal and your awareness. So it's like you probe, this gives an impulse. Well, the probing causes an influence. There's some influence that happens. Influence happens. From the influence causes an impulse. Now, what's an impulse? An impulse is not a response. Okay, so a lot of people think of it as like you probe and then what you get is a response. But it's not exactly like that. You probe, some kind of influence happens, and this gives an impulse in the body. So the impulse is a wave of excitation that happens in the body. Okay, so impulse comes from the root word impel, and impel has to do with causes. So an impulse is not a response. An impulse is more like a cause. An impulse is a wave of excitation transmitted through tissues, and especially nerve fibers and muscles, that results in physiological activity or inhibition, like a nerve impulse, a sudden spontaneous inclination or incitement to some usually unpremeditated action, a propensity or natural tendency, usually other than rational. So that's what this impulse is. So this is experienced as this kind of like these vibrations that happen in your mind and body when you probe. So when you next time you do a remote viewing session, you pay attention to what happens in your body. When you probe, there's a vibration, there's an impulse that comes into the body. The impulse is like an energetic phenomenon, okay? It has to be like interpreted by the processing intelligences within your mind and in your body. So the impulse is not perceived like directly. The impulse has to be like kind of like translated. There's got to be like certain pieces of information within your awareness or within your reality box, within your vocabulary, so to speak, that can like match up to this impulse. So there's kind of like a little translation process that has to happen here. And this translation process, that's where you get your reaction or your response. Okay? That's where you get your reaction and your response from. So the first type of AOL, the one that can be reduced, that one comes like down here. That's like whenever you got an impulse, you got the reaction or response to it, and now you're like thinking about your reaction or your response. That's the first kind of AOL. So you probe, influence happens, you get an impulse. The impulse is like, gives you some kind of like, you have some kind of like perception or reaction to it. Like it may be vague, you know, you get a word, you get whatever it is, smell, taste, temperature, some kind of perception happens, your reaction or your response, the result or the effect happens, and then the first kind of AOL is just thinking, analyzing these different reactions and responses. So let's say you had a bunch of these, or you know, one came through strongly. That's you thinking about this and trying to make a name about it, you know, saying it's this or that. That's the first kind of AOL that can be reduced. The second kind of AOL, the AOL over the signal type that may not be able to be reduced, that happens here. The impulse, this translation process, this may create, you may only have a certain vocabulary, a certain concept in your mental arsenal to represent what this impulse is, right? So you may have to use the wrong concept or wrong term. It may not be the right term or concept, but it's all you have to work with. It's the only word or the only part of your mental vocabulary that you have to represent what you can suss out of this impulse. So you should use it. It's not like, oh, that's an AOL, let me avoid it. No, you should be using it. But not only that, it's your best tool to communicate that idea. So you got to stop worrying about being like naming the target or, you know, saying what it is exactly to what like your intellectual expectation is. You need to focus more on describing the actual essence behind what the target is, and your AOL can do that, and it can be, you know, as good as an explanation as naming it. So don't be afraid of AOLs, and start to realize the difference between an impulse and like your response or reaction, right? The impulse and the response or reaction to the impulse, and your thinking or analysis of your response or reaction to the impulse. So it's kind of like these three stages that happen. So as you get better, you'll stop doing this third one. You'll be able to stop thinking about what happens in the session. But this one might still happen, but that's okay. You know what I mean? That's alright. I hope that kind of like explains the difference between like thinking AOL, analysis AOL, and like AOL over the signal. The translation of this impulse into like your actual response or perception of it. So there's like two different kinds of like AOLs that happen. Here's a clip of these experiments being done on this man who has his corpus callosum has been severed. So his left and right hemisphere don't communicate the same way as in most adults. So in this experiment, he's being flashed different words to different sides of the brain, and depending on the types of intelligence that interpret these signals, he acts out in different ways. His conscious mind takes that information that was kind of like subliminally inserted, and he acts out on it, and his conscious mind doesn't even know the reason why. It just makes up a story as to why it did it, just like a viewer does when they commit AOL. So AOL is more about these different intelligences within us that are communicating with each other and into our conscious awareness, and it can usually be attributed to like an overworking of one, right? Because you're working with limited information. So in this case, in this video, this man has a severed corpus callosum, so he's not getting the full picture at once. In remote viewing, you're not getting the full picture because the target's hidden. You're not getting the full picture at all.
Hey Joe, I want you to keep your hands out in front of you.
In an experiment that's now a classic in brain research, Mike Gazzaniga over 30 years ago used a similar setup to find out if the two halves of the brain are specialized to do different things.
Ship.
Joe is being flashed a word only to one half of his brain. Words flashed to the right
Storm.
are seen only by his left brain, and Joe can report seeing those words just fine.
Piano. Good.
But when a word is flashed to his right brain,
Didn't see that. Okay. Joe, I'm going to ask you
but now watch what happens.
to draw that with your left hand.
You get me lost.
Why don't you try drawing another picture of it over here if that will help you.
Oh, phone.
Oh, okay.
Durr.
It's almost as though somebody has given him a secret communication.
That's
and
right.
Now he knows that it's a telephone, but up until then he was blind to it.
You point to the word.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why,
Yeah, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
and when asked to explain,
It was music and bell, and those few minutes ago, last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here, banging away.
The bell's
Yeah.
outside here.
So, look, good enough answer to me.
what's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain, is the left hemisphere's most marvelous property.
One of the unique things to the human brain is this need to interpret why two events occurred. What was the antecedent to this? What caused this?
So most of us think of intelligence as like this like single like aspect of the mind. Like if you could visualize your consciousness, most people would think of it as like, I don't know, like, intelligence being like this huge part of it, and it's just like, intelligence. But in reality, it's more like we have different intelligences. So like an IQ test, it's not necessarily testing intelligence per se. It's testing like one kind of intelligence that we have, and that's like the memorization, like simple level problem solving, like response to like a pre-memorized question type stuff. You know what I mean? Doing some like math problems. That's like the kind of intelligence that they're testing with the IQ test. But there's all these other kinds of intelligences that you can imagine are in here, and they're all linked together. They're all talking to each other, and if you put too much of a load on one intelligence, it's gonna like make the whole system like kind of like muck up, or put stress on another part of the system. So you can imagine like AOL as like AOL can like occur. You can think of AOL happening when like one part of the system is too stressed. So you can think of it as like these overlapping intelligences, and then your awareness is like this little thing in the middle. And you know, depending on your ability to expand your awareness, you become aware of these different things and these different intelligences. But they're all speaking to each other. They're all trading information, and then it's kind of like compressed. A bunch of it's like cut off, and then only a certain amount will actually enter into like your conscious awareness, right? So AOL can occur usually when you're like taxing one intelligence too much. You know what I mean? Like you're asking too much from one kind of intelligence, and it doesn't have those kind of answers for you. You need to like query some of the other types of intelligences within the body or within the consciousness. But it's hard to like query something that you don't know exists, like you don't know you have. So that's the main problem with like human consciousness. You gotta like kind of like become aware of something to actually like orient it and use it or give power to it. So becoming aware of the different intelligences will give you like a better spectrum to pull information from whenever you're like trying to make a decision or make a call in a remote viewing session. It's like having a council of like wise men. All right. So if you're only going for sights, if you're only going for smells, tastes, temperatures, that's like asking like just the sensory intelligences for information. It's like you're not going to find out certain other things. So you need to like probe, enter into the different intelligence systems in order to get certain kinds of information as well. So you're probably saying like, what do you mean? What do you mean different intelligence systems? Like I can see, I can hear, everything's working. Well, these are like faculties of the mind. Okay, I'm going to talk about visual agnosia. Now this is a kind of disorder, perceptual disorder or deficiency that people have. Usually it's a result of some kind of like brain damage, usually like different types of like strokes. People get damage to certain regions of the brain, which causes them to lack certain perceptual like qualities or faculties. So their eyes are fine, a lot of them are very intelligent people, they can function pretty much normally in most senses, but they have like these little quirks. So for example, there's two main types of agnosia that are very interesting in relation to remote viewing. So, because the same type of like underlying intelligences of the mind or faculties seem to be at play here. So, agnosia is not a disorder of the senses, okay? There's two types of agnosia that we're looking at here. So, there's aperceptive agnosia, which is like failure of object recognition. So if I showed someone with aperceptive agnosia this marker, they wouldn't be able to like draw the marker. Like if I told them like draw a picture of this marker, they wouldn't be able to draw it. They can't take this visual information, take it in, create that impulse which gives the right response for them to perceive this, even this image. They can't even perceive the image properly. Okay? And then there's associative agnosia, which is people that they can get the forms, they can see the forms, they can form the mental image pattern, but then they're unable to associate the correct concepts or words, the names, to the actual objects. So one person wouldn't be able to tell me that this is a marker by looking at it, whereas the other person would be able to look at it and see that it's a marker, but wouldn't be able to name that it's a marker. Alright, so they could be able to draw it, but then after they draw it, they still wouldn't be able to look at even their drawing and be like, okay, I drew a marker. So it's kind of like similar to what happens in remote viewing, right? A remote viewer can draw an image that's exactly what the target is, and you ask them what it is, and they're like, I don't know what it is, right? So it's because there's these, it's like some kind of like conversation going on in the subconscious processing areas of these different units of information processing that speak to each other, But for some reason, you know, probably due to the brain damage in these people, those intelligences aren't kicking in. They're not playing their role. So it's putting stress on another area of their perception, and usually they get things wrong. So here's a video clip of someone with visual associative agnosia. So they're getting shown a bunch of different objects, and they usually have to resort to, you'll see one object, he smells it, and that puts him on the right track. He has to use his hands to like feel the objects. At one point, his hands give him the answer. So he's looking at this object, which is a combination lock, and he doesn't know what it is, and not until his hands are doing this motion of like opening a lock that he looks at his own hands and says, oh yeah, it's like a combination lock. So that's like an example of like this other intelligence kind of like speaking through the body to convey some information that, you know, the part of us that we think of as our intellect or the intelligence part, it doesn't get all the information. It's not just one piece. It's like a team that works together within us that gives us these fully formed impressions. And during remote viewing, since you're getting like disjointed pieces of information, like you're not getting all the information at once, you suffer from like kind of like the same thing that someone with like this agnosia is going through. You don't get you're not getting all the pieces of information, so you know all the intelligences aren't necessarily kicking in at the right time to give you the right information. So you form this kind of like incorrect image. So here's an image. Here's a video of this person with visual agnosia, associative agnosia, and just listen to the dialogue, look at the person's hands and what they say, and you know if you're into remote viewing, you can recognize that it almost sounds like someone being interviewed at a remote viewing session. It's kind of like this struggle to work within oneself to figure something out. So check this out.
Name a few things.
Okay.
What is that?
Apple.
Okay, good. And what is that?
Candle.
Good.
Crayon type stuff, you know.
Okay, which is it?
Crayon. Because that smells better.
Is this a crayon or a
That's
candle?
a crayon shaped like a candle. Really?
Well, if it's shaped like a candle, why wouldn't it be a candle?
Because it smells like a crayon.
Oh, I didn't notice you smell. What is that?
It's a pipe.
Okay, good. Sure. And I'd like to have you just tell me what you do with that.
Right with it.
I don't want you to tell me. Show me what you do with it.
You're right.
I'm sorry.
It's a pen, you know.
Hold your hands up here where we can see and show me what you do with it.
You're right with it. It's like a ballpoint pen, you know, but it's not a ballpoint pen.
Well, take your time and see if you can show me what you do with this.
Well, you're right with it, but you know this. I don't know, because I know it doesn't come into focus right. You know, is that a flute or something?
Okay, that's close. What is that?
I don't know.
How'd you figure that one out?
Because that's not the way I put my hands, I know. Because I've never been in a flute, and that's the first thing I thought of.
Uh-huh. Did your hands figure out before you had it in your mouth? Mm-hmm.
That's weird. What is that?
That's a clarinet.
Ah, it's close.
That's very close. That's good. Happens sometimes you get something stuck in your head.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I want you to give up the telephone. It's not a telephone.
Okay. Okay. I'm really at a loss. I can't. It just isn't making any sense at all now.
Is it bigger than a cat or smaller than a cat?
Than a cat? Well, it's probably smaller than a cat.
About what size is it?
Oh, it's about that long.
Mm-hmm. About what size is it? Telephone. Just
about yay by yay.
So this is smaller than a telephone?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does it have anything to do with communication?
Yeah, because this is the numbers you gotta hook up with them in order to dial your number or something, you know.
And why do you dial the number?
Because that's evidently what that dial is for. I don't know. Yeah.
Let me give you a hint.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a choice, and you tell me what this is.
Okay, I can tell you then.
Okay. Is this a clock, a lock, or a telephone?
A lock.
Is it a lock?
A clock, a lock, or a telephone? Okay, let's rule out a telephone. What? A clock or a lock? Clock. That'd be a lock. Must be a lock then.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not. But I don't recognize it as a telephone.
Mm-hmm. Do you recognize it as a lock?
No, honestly, I don't. But it's just it really looks very indescript to me.
Uh-huh. But your hands know what they want to do.
I know, and they want to do something.
That's right.
I can see them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I can just picture them, and I know that I have. It's like I'm undoing a combination lock.
Good. Huh. Okay, good. We had to work on that one, didn't we?
No shit.
So as you can see there in that video, kind of like the different intelligences that are like in play. When one hits like a roadblock, you know what I mean? He's looking at this thing and he's seeing the picture, it's there, but the actual faculty or intelligence inside that actually kicks in and recognizes and associates the name or the concept to that image, it's lacking. So it took the intelligence of the hands, whatever intelligence that is, some body intelligence, to kind of like send him a different message, like, oh, the hands would go like this, and through that he came to a recognition of what it was, right? So the same thing can happen in remote viewing. Alright, reducing AOL is more about learning about these different intelligences and interpreting them the right way, right? So at one point he was convinced that the combination lock was a phone. He was talking about the number dial, and he's like, well, evidently that's used for dialing in numbers, and that's how you like call people. That's exactly like what happens in a remote viewing session. A viewer gets one piece and they say, well, of course that's used for this, so therefore it must be that. And that's that thinking stuff we were talking about earlier, when you're comparing and making deductions about things. So it got to a point where he was thinking about things. He wasn't actually in the act of actual perceiving, right? And even at one point the woman said, sometimes you get things stuck in your head, so let's try and leave that idea alone. Well, the same thing happens in remote viewing. Your analytical mind, your conscious mind, the awareness part of you that wants to come to a conclusion, that intelligence is always trying to make a conclusion for you, and once it makes that conclusion, it wants to hold on to it. So sometimes you gotta let that go, and that's what AOL is about: writing it down, letting it go. And after you do that enough times, you'll learn to relax that faculty. Here's another clip of another man who has a certain type of visual agnosia, and so he's looking at this photo. He's able to make out certain aspects of it, but when he tries to think about it or come to a conclusion on it, he completely butchers what it is, and he draws a bunch of logical fallacies and comes to incorrect conclusions. basically the same type of thing happens in a remote viewing session. This is almost exactly like what happens to most people in a remote viewing session. So check it out, and you can kind of see how the same type of faculties are at play here. The same type of phenomenon is going on in the person that has this these missing faculties from the stroke or brain damage, and a remote viewer who's working with disjointed partial information.
What about this one?
There's a dog. No, well, all right. It's either a real dog or a dog model, because I can work out that it is a dog squatted down.
What about this in the background? What would you make of that?
I'm trying to, at the moment, to make some sense out of it. It could be a tree of sorts, or a very large shrub.
Is it out of doors or indoors in the picture?
Well, if it's a shrub, then it must be out of doors.
I'm quite sure about that.
Well, I can't see why a shrub that big.
What do you think this is here?
I imagine from the shape of it, it must be a door into a house.
A door into a house?
Into a house, I think. Because it's obviously a heavy door.
And what would you say that was then?
I imagine that's a picture. No, it can't be a picture. Because if that was the outside of the house, you're not going to have pictures hanging, at least you're not likely to have pictures hanging on the outside. I, having so far worked out that it is an exterior picture, she's pointed out to something which I thought perhaps was a window, which doesn't look too much like a window when I try to work out what it is. So...
What's this round here on the bottom of the tree then?
Well, I was going to say that was some sort of ornamental collection of stones or something on a pathway.
Well, I think I put you out of your misery. It's actually a Christmas tree in a room with Sheba sitting beside it.
Well, I mean, really, that's a...
Those are the presents.
That's a cheap picture.
So the main thing, you know, I want you to take away from this whole thing is that there's a difference between the impulse. There's a difference between the impulse and the response. Okay? And there's a difference between the response and your analysis of the response, or thinking of it. Alright? So, impulse is not, it's an energetic phenomenon. It's something that you feel. It doesn't have words. It's inspecific. Okay? It becomes specific once your consciousness, your awareness can make it into something that makes sense. It makes an impression on your awareness. The impulse makes an impression. What's an impression? Well, you know, not only like an impression, like a stamp, like when something's impressed on you, but like impression, like you're trying to copy something. You know what I mean? Your best rendition, your best impression of someone. So you're gonna give your best impression of the impulse, and you know, an impression is never going to be the exact thing, right? It's like trying to be the thing, you know. And if you're good enough, if you're good at giving impressions, or doing impressions, then you know you're going to do a pretty good job at turning the impulse into an impression. Now, you can have a response, you know, to the impulse. The impulse will usually be something abrupt, something that drives you, something fast. It's not something you think of. It happens right away. As soon as you did that probe, this impulse came, and it usually drives you to do something. All right, which is like the response. So this causes something. The response doesn't cause something. per se, it doesn't cause something, but it can cause you to think about it. You know, if your analysis thinking comes in, yeah, it can cause you to think. You can think about this and cause something else to happen. All right. So basically, in remote viewing, you're practicing turning these impulses into responses without thinking about them. All right, without analyzing them. As you get deeper in the session, and the impulses get stronger, your responses, or your ability to give responses that better match the impulse, will become better. They'll become stronger impulses, and you won't be worrying about thinking about them. You're not going to be worrying about thinking about the responses. The responses will be more in line with the target. That naming it, you're going to be on the money. You'll be on the money. You know what I mean. You won't even know it, but you're going to be on the money. So it's a subtle difference. You got to learn how to not do this. Don't think about the response. You move on to the next probe. You move on. You move forward. It's like playing music. You don't stop to read the last note, whether you got it right or wrong. So AOL, to some extent, will always occur because there's an interface between what we call perception and knowledge. Perception and knowledge, they interface with each other. Okay? So you can perceive something, but you got to have a knowledge of it in order to like explain it or communicate it in some way, right? So this is where AOL happens, and sometimes the reason to not be afraid of AOL or not to avoid AOL is because you may be avoiding you're going to be avoiding the interface to the target. Like that's where if that's the only thing in your knowledge that matches the perception, well then you got to use it, right? You can just work on building a bigger library of like mental vocabulary, you know what I mean? The more you read, the more words you know, the more concepts you're aware of, the more expanded your awareness, the better you'll be at getting the right perceptions, right? Explaining the perception correctly, right? So there's like this interfacing that happens. So that's why there's always like some kind of overlay that may occur. That's just how communication works, right? Another interesting thing about AOL is, fearing AOL or like, dancing around it or worrying about it, it really doesn't make any difference because whether you write it under a column that says AOL over here, or you wrote it in your data collection matrix, it's still recorded in the session. So that's what I mean by AOL is like, it's kind of like this ego problem. Usually whenever someone writes, like, if someone gets, like, say something was a church, and they wrote church in their S4 under intangibles, or under tangibles, there was a church. They said there's a church there. And it turns out it's right. There is a church. It was a church. The target was a church. They'd be so excited and happy that they got it right. Like, it's a great hit, church. Now, if they wrote church over here, and imagine they didn't write it here, but they wrote it over here in AOL, church. They're still going to say, you're still going to be like, oh wow, I wrote church in the AOL. I got it right. You get what I'm saying? So it's like, does it really matter where it gets written on the page? Like, unless you're like doing some intense databasing and people's lives are on the line and you're like working for the military, which I'm not, then, once you get to a certain level, once you get to a certain experience level of remote viewing, you're not as worried about this whole phenomenon, okay? You'll write it whenever it's needed. You're not going to be worrying about AOL. You're going to explain yourself. You'll stop jumping to conclusions and naming, and you'll get more into explaining and describing the signals that are coming into you. So perceiving something is not as basic as it seems on the surface. Like I was saying with the whole cause and effect, it's not just like stuff comes in and then it's just there. It's more, it's a couple stages to it. So like detecting a feature is a separate process from like sensing it, like in the first place. So like something gets sensed, then you got to detect what you sense. You got to detect something from there, detect a feature. So you detect something from what you sensed, right? And then from what you detect, you create a pattern. Create a pattern, and then from the pattern, it's got to get recognized. The pattern has to be recognizable. Has to get recognized. And then, after you recognize it, you got to associate the correct, like, concept or name. Concept, stroke, name. To what's recognized. Okay? So, there's, like, you know, there's a bunch of things that go on here. So, you know, you're getting raw data, gets sensed. You know, whether you detect something out of that, whether you detected anything, that's a whole nother question. Whether there's a discernible pattern from that, you know, more data can be lost there. Things can be distorted, misunderstood. Then there's a, you know, is it recognized? Is the pattern recognized as an actual thing, something that you can actually turn into a word? And if it is, can you associate the right concept or word to that thing? So it's, you know, this is what happens. It's not as like clear as night and day, and the more you do remote viewing and you have these experiences happen and you get the feedback, the better you're going to be at sensing, detecting, and recognizing and associating the correct concepts and ideas and names to the impulses, alright? And that, yeah, that can eventually lead to, yeah, naming stuff and, you know, calling it right out. You don't have to, you can build a certain level of confidence in your ability. So a lot of this has to do with confidence. Once you get more confident, you're gonna list the impulse. You're gonna list your responses without even thinking if they're an AOL or not. Okay, because you're gonna gain a certain amount of trust in your abilities and in your intelligences, right? Like you wouldn't question whether the ground is underneath your feet right now, right? Because you know you trust the feeling from your feet. Well, with remote viewing, you know you can get to the point where you're gonna get a certain amount of trust in the signals that you get from your body. If you made it this far into this video, thank you for watching. That means you're probably pretty interested in this subject. Kudos to you. We need more, you know, intelligent, awake, and in touch people in the world. If you found this information enlightening, or you know, you found it useful, any donations or contributions are greatly appreciated. My PayPal is in the description, and if you'd like to donate cryptos, my addresses are listed here as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Naeem, and take care, y'all.